Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation. We agreed to start at 3 o'clock, and we have people already joining. So we'll get started. We'll just move into the conversation. So, am I audible enough, though? I hope you can hear me. Hello. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. All right. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining from, because I know people are joining across multiple time zones. Thanks for making the time to be part of this conversation. A very timely and necessary one for that matter, where we are going to have conversations on how we can redesign inclusive and accessible urban cities in Africa. And this is coming from a lived experience where, we see the fast rise in Africa's urban population. However, this increases attention where you have on one side, the city presents an opportunity for people. At the same time, the city now becomes more like a place of survival where people are just hanging along, people are just going by. So we would interrogate all these two realities and how we can build a city that leaves no one behind. So thanks for joining us for today. In preparation towards this, we asked a simple question about what your expectations were, and we had very interesting insights. And we asked, "What does a livable city mean to you?" And we had answers. Which were very exciting. People talking about a place where it's optimized for efficiency in delivery of social services. People simply said they want a place or a city with basic amenities. People said they wanted a place which is a well-governed urban space. And the answers are on and on and on and on. So it's very interesting how we all have different perspectives as to how urban spaces or our cities should be. But at the same time, there's a point of convergence where all our ideas, all our suggestions meet at a point where we are looking at designing a space that leaves no one behind, a space that is functional, a space that supports the ambitions and dreams of every single occupant of that space. So that is it. More context about this conversation. We are not having this conversation in isolation. It is hosted by a team of a team sculptor behind this. We simply say we shape brands that impact today. And in doing this, we work across brand management, brand design, strategy, and all that. And for some years now, we pivoted more into impact, where we focus on how our work translates into various communities, various people, and even the environment. And I lead the impact angle department for Sculpta. I'm Kwabena Asare, and I'll be the moderator for today. Now, we are actually on the journey to inspire over 100,000 plus global shapers. And in doing this, we have multiple projects, which this conversation is part of the project. Um, we launched this 2 years ago. It is called Lift, and our focus is on people and change. That is focusing on people or organizations who are actually having real impact on the ground. So for 2 years running, we have had over 80 submissions from NGOs and also across 7 countries and over 5 sectors. So that is what brings us here today. In 2024, we worked with a nonprofit called GoTo, and they are mainly focused on building sustainable local solutions for people in our local spaces. We supported their brand identity. We developed a strategy which would translate into them meeting their objectives. And for this year, we are working with LUDI, that is the Lagos Urban Development Initiative, which is an advocacy urban design group based in Lagos pushing for a better city for all. So that is what brings us here today. We will be having conversations with practitioners, visionaries, researchers who collectively have decades of experience in the space. So we will be hearing from Olamide, who is the founder of Lagos Urban Development Initiative. We would have Ibrahim Mahama, who is an artist and founder for the Savannah Center for Contemporary Arts. We would have Savonnaé Street, who is a planner with Arts Canada. And like I said, I'm Kwabena Asare. I'll be moderating today's conversation. Our focus will be on three key things. One, the urgency of the matter. Why should we now, of all the times, consider building cities that carry people along? We will also be looking at the voices that matter. How do we make sure that people who occupy these spaces have a say in the kind of place they would want to be? And then finally, we will also be looking at how we can basically design better. So this is by way of introducing today's conversation. Thanks for joining us today, and we would definitely keep this as interactive as possible. As the conversation is going on, if you have any questions, I think you can drop it in the message box, and we definitely do well to attend. I would go to the speakers, and I think Ibrahim, if you're on, or Savonnaé, whoever is ready, I think we can take your initial thoughts about the theme, introduce yourself, and why the conversation matters to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, as the power crisis, there was a big storm in Tamale 2 days ago. So they've been turning on the lights on, off, on, off, on, off. So as you were making the introduction, a large chunk of it went off because the lights went off suddenly. So I hope it doesn't whilst I'm on this soon. So let's keep our fingers crossed. But nonetheless, thank you very much for inviting me to contribute towards the topic. It's actually something that is very important to me. Certainly, I'm an artist. You're aware of. I studied at Kwame Nkrumah University. I did painting and sculpture at the university from 2006 till 10, and then did my master's and also started a PhD at some point. But the whole point of doing art at this level was to ask the one relevant question about accessibility and what art really is. It's about form. Like when we're making art, what do we really think about when we're making it, and who is it for? And also the materials that constitute making art. Where are the materials coming from? What is the legacy of these materials in relation to our shared histories, things like that. Certainly, I grew up in a very urban space such as Accra, but of course, at some point, I was also thinking about ways in which I could expand or move on. Of course, when you look up even Accra alone, there's so many interesting spaces in terms of buildings, landmarks and all that. A lot of these spaces, which aside the histories that they bear, there are also spaces that could also just be public spaces where people could just even share within those spaces. But you realize that they are not actually public spaces or spaces that people can actually use ordinarily. So in my work, that was some of the questions that I was asking myself. That how do we intervene within these kinds of spaces? I'm going to show some slides, some of them just images to go through. And yeah, so let me share this. Is it full screen?
Yes, it's on full screen.
Great. So I want us to focus on this idea of repair, what it means to be able to repair something, and also what it means, like the burden of history, the burden of weight. Like I like to call this accumulated historical labor on memory. There's this horror movie that a group of friends killed a girl, and then her ghost somehow lashes onto one of the protagonist's body, and then every time he goes to the hospital, his weight, like he seems to be very heavy, but nothing shows that he's supposed to be that heavy. And I always like to think about it in that sense, that history, somehow the burden of history and accumulated history in terms of the urban, the rural and all that, it's somehow something that is actually upon our shoulders in terms of the different sense of responsibility that we could exercise within our generation to reshape and also to reopen some of these things. I like to think about the labor of ghosts and the ghost of labor. When we build things, like when I started the idea of building SCCA, the Savannah and everything, it wasn't so much about the idea of just building a space that I could use, but it was more or less also acknowledging the history of labor and the history of forms that actually contribute towards building. For instance, we're talking about building urban spaces, the city and all that. But most often when we're building, we forget why we're building these spaces and who we are building it for and what we are building it for. So that burden that I was referring to in the shutter is something that we constantly have to think about when we're making. So I remember when I started building the studio in 2015, the idea was just to build a studio, but politically, as I started thinking more about it in relation to this idea of like the old trains that were used historically during the colonial period, or airplanes that have been used, and how we can excavate this sense of potentials from them and then use them for other purposes and open other kinds of imaginative forms within them, then suddenly you begin to think about all these expansive ideas. So if we even take like the shoemaker box that they use in repairing shoes in the urban landscape, the question of repair within that tiny space, how do we extend that question of repair into a much more bigger context? Because when we see the shoemaker boys, we also don't think about the fact that most of them sleep out in the streets and all that. But we always say that, oh, we're designing the city for everyone. But no, it's not. But at the same time, within the box, the question of repair is where we can sometimes even excavate this question of courage in order to be able to open up the city a lot more. So for instance, when I buy some of the trains, some of the methods or people that we work with in order to be able to dismantle the train or to move them from one place to the other, people who don't seem to be part of the city, but sometimes they are the ones who rather are able to find the courage in order to be able to make the most impossible things happen. So some of the spaces like in our generation that we can also do is to revive. So for instance, this is an old building, the silo, one of the many silos that was built by Nkrumah back in the 60s. And the question was that how do we revive these spaces? So for us as an artist, if I work and I make money, can I buy some of these spaces back from the States? And how can we excavate, repair, and then make these spaces accessible to all? Because in this space, I remember when I bought it, there were bats and all kinds of other ecosystems. There's like an army of owls and all kinds of other species living in the building. But the question is that even when we take over, when we're thinking about the urban, is it only in relation to the human being, or are we thinking about it in relation to like ecological systems and things like that? So all these are things to think about. I like our traditional customs, like in Winneba, they have the Abuachre Festival where the young men go and catch a live deer. So the question is then, if we can, in our traditional practices, if we can go and catch the deer from the forest, why can't we summon that same sense of courage in order to be able to, for instance, move an object from one place to the other in terms of preservation and also opening up, let's say, the various interactions within the rural or the urban. And this is an image of, there's a glass factory which was once in the western part of Ghana, which last year it was sold as scraps. So I bought more than half of the factory and I had to save all the bottles and all, like even more than I saved a lot of the building. So buying the building, working with engineers to dismantle the whole building and transporting it all the way to Tamale to rebuild it, because we're thinking about the question of the archive and the lived memory within the space. So, and also what does it mean to be able to transport these single bottles and treating them almost as if, because remember, because the whole of red clay is built of bricks and bricks are carried one at a time and built one at a time. You can't treat it in a multitude, you know? So it also comes back down to the question of the hand and the labor, which I was talking about, and how we think about it in relation to the urban. So again, objects, what role do objects play within the question of the urban and how it becomes livable? It's not just a livability in relation to human life, but it's livability in relation to the life of the objects in themselves and what they represent. All the lives of young people, especially children. So these are like children from the community who are visiting like the studio. If we're building spaces, because the studio or the, like even in our practices, whether you're an architect, an urban planner, there's studios on what we produce. They are political, deep political spaces. We cannot be producing in isolation. The point also is that when we are producing in our generation, how do we open up that space in such a way that it allows for even people who normally would think that, oh, this yellow driver oh, these people, a lot of people tend to say that you are not sophisticated. They don't know what culture or art is. But a lot of them are even far more cultured than a lot of us who go to school. So the question is not so much about formal education, but it's about the question of our lived experiences and how we bring that to the world that we live in. So for instance, school children, kids in the community, when we are reassembling a train or building sculptures, how even when they're playing within these spaces, what impacts does it have on them in relation to how they think about the future? And also when we are reconstituting some of these spaces, like taking the old rail lines, rebuilding them in the studios. For instance, when we brought the rail lines to Tamale, it was the first time that many people in Tamale had seen rail lines before. Even in the Gold Coast, back in the colonial period where these rail lines were built, a lot of people don't see them anymore because a lot of them have been scrapped. So the question is also about archaeology, not in terms of the physicality of the object, but also with regards to what kind of excavations in terms of imagination and other things that these objects can bring along. So what does it mean bringing school children in order to be able to witness these forms and what they do? So even images like this, where you're looking at the children posing in front of these objects, these pictures should not exist. But it's that we're trying to it's almost as if we're somehow reigniting a new age of imagination where we are bringing historical forms or we're bringing history into the present in order to be able to chart new futures. And also like some of the spaces like the Parliament of Ghosts and others, my wife is a chef, so even sometimes when like she's doing food experiences, the idea is that how do we use like the airplane, which normally is just meant for like flying, as a place of a classroom or as a dining experience or things like that? How do we occupy various spaces within the space, within the world? And then if we take objects and we make artworks, one of the other questions too is that, do these artworks only belong in the West where capital is accumulated? Or these works can also be experienced in a local community in London versus in Ghana, in Tamale, where school kids have to run 40 kilometers in order to be able to see a work of art. So it's also the question, again, I want us to stress on the question of courage, because whilst we are producing, and most often in our practices, when we're producing, what we realize is that most of the work ends up within a context where only a certain group of people in the world can experience. But the question is that how do we open up even our own practices in order for it to be able to serve a much wider? This image is very important for me because here you see that the kids are using the architecture the same time whilst the builders are building the same space. Traditionally in architecture, this doesn't happen. Everything has to be done and then there has to be a ribbon cut, blah, blah, blah. No. But this time around, we're sharing the process of what we are building, because what you also realize is that there's a coding happening here. The kids in 20, 40, 30 years, a lot of them when they're older and they have children, their memory of what the space was as they were building, as they were using, is sometimes what will shape how they use it or how they contribute towards further building and opening up of other spaces in the future. So even when we, like, for instance, extend it again back to the ecosystem, transforming spaces that are made for us, but now into like ecological, like spaces that allow for us to think about ecology differently, or thinking about rural architecture, like the straw that they use in making the things in the villages. How do we bring that within the context of the contemporary, or like the sticks that they are using for farming, for protecting the crops from animals and things like that. And by the way, these are the women from the communities that we work with. So again, all these labor forms which are in it comes back down to the question of why it is important for us to be able to create a very inclusive world that opens up to all kinds of people. And this is the last images where I'm showing images of like the stadium. I remember there was a big artwork I did in London last year, and the idea was to make it accessible to people, but also to think about the production. So for instance, we hired more than 1,000 women and men, and then we hired a stadium in Tamale when we were not playing football games, and we used the stadium to produce the work. So again, what does it, so this is an image of it. So what does it mean in order to be able to extend what we do into all these kinds of other spaces? Because one might think, oh, the stadium aside, maybe football, large concerts and things like that, but all kinds of other things. And it's a political ground. So again, what do we do with this political ground? So if you see this image like of a work in London, for me, this rather of the work in Tamale or within the rural, the local urban context, and how it borrows traditions from the rural to make it is very important. And again, these are just images of like local people we're working with, or generations of people that their work, the decisions that we make within this kind of urban conversation has to be able to affect. And the women in the communities who bring their children on their motorbikes to visit public spaces or parks or all kinds of other things. That is some of the things that we're looking for. And lastly, the question is also about redistribution. So for instance, if we are building things, sometimes we realize that when we are building things, we might be able to build, but then there's a gap between what we build and what we propose, and then the people who use it. So again, how do we go out of our way in order to be able to open up what we build in terms of its making, in terms of its distribution, and also in terms of its livability, in terms of how people think about it, how they think that they are part of it whilst they're making it, whilst those things are being made, so that at least the world can be a much more open and better place, particularly within this, within the question of the urban. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. I think this sets the tone for the conversation today. A very interesting thing about your work is how you make us rethink objects and things like straws, things like shoemaker's box. These are everyday things that form part of people's lived experiences. However, we tend not to pay attention to them, and rather we build thinking that these people are not part of our society and all that. So thanks very much for amazing work you're doing up in the north, and also for helping these young kids who may have not, if not for your intervention, may not have ever seen a train or even the histories behind it. So I think kudos to you and the team for all that is being done. We would move to Savonnaé, who also has an interesting perspective to share about the idea of making spaces livable and how we can redesign these urban spaces to be much more accessible and inclusive as possible. So yeah, Sav, I think you have the floor now.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? Yes?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Before I do any sort of introduction, I just want to say thank you to Ibrahim for sharing all those photos and that information about your work. My name is Savonnaé Street. I am based in Ontario, Canada. I'm a researcher, singer-songwriter, and urban planning professional, and currently doing work for Parks Canada at the federal level. And I think one of the really interesting things that Ibrahim highlighted, which has come out of the research work that I've done, is recognizing and kind of shifts, I mean, obviously from that Canadian perspective into the African urban setting, is that informality has to be recognized as central, right? It's not a marginal piece of this conversation. And a lot of my work kind of critiques explicit equity policies in those formal planning documents that planners utilize to do their work. And I think many African cities kind of suffer from the opposite. So that formal planning often, it excludes or it criminalizes the informal sector. And in that context, I think making urban spaces livable really means legitimizing those spaces and incorporating them into the official urban planning kind of framework. It's really important to highlight and focus on the fact that there are structural and very much historical disadvantages that exist. And those are from colonial planning legacies. And a lot of those things shape spatial and economic exclusion, and they can't be negated as part of this conversation as well. And when we talk about the context of a livable city, those things have to be recognized as first and foremost, that they really are the biggest piece of why we see a lot of structural and historical disadvantages to folks who are part of the informal informal sector in terms of the way that they work, live, and even play. And we have to reimagine what governance and participation looks like. It has to be participatory. It has to ensure that we're bringing in both those formal and informal governance systems and bridging them together. And I think organizations that are nonprofits or kind of sit in the middle of those things have to be the key drivers of bringing those groups and those things together, and recognizing that it's really that bottom up kind of urbanism that will really lead to more progressive change. And that solely has to focus on things that are community led in terms of infrastructure in some ways, housing, safety initiatives, and incorporating arts and culture with which are crucial to building community, right? Those are the things that bring us together and help us to find ways to contribute to city making that are not in the formal system. So really, when we think about equity as a lens and use that to ensure that urban spaces are livable in that context of African cities, which a lot of the time is really a place of informality, we're recognizing that those informal systems are really essential, and centering the needs of people who are actively living, working, playing in these cities within policy and within design. And really thinking about ways we can redistribute what justice looks like, and focusing not just on growth in terms of economics, but also where is the power given to make decisions and to make changes.
Right. I think that's a very good take, and it is very, very loaded, very, very loaded. And I think probably if we proceed into the questions and answers bit, we'll get to unpack some of these feelings. But you made a good point about incorporating art and culture in our spaces, because these are the things that bring people together. And what's the essence of a space if people are not able to freely interact with shared identities or shared interests? So culture and art is very, very critical to our idea of making spaces livable. For those of us who join later on, we are having this conversation in the context of an ongoing work between Sculpta and the Lagos Urban Development Initiative, which is a project that every single year we identify a nonprofit organization who is doing amazingly well on the ground with tangible impact to show. And we try as much as possible to offer brand strategy and design support so that they are able to scale up, they're able to connect to the right stakeholders. And most importantly, they are able to impact the various communities and people that they are looking at reaching on the ground. So for 2 years running, and we've been doing this, and so far, it's actually a learning experience for us, because every single nonprofit or every single people we get to interact with, they share an insight that hitherto we may not have even considered, and it enriches our work, it enriches our social interactions and all that. Talking about the Lagos Urban Development Initiative, we have Miriam here, who is part of the LUDI team. I think she would share what is being done on the ground and also how the idea of livability actually means to her and the organization. So Miriam, I think you have the floor now. You can go.
All right, Kwabena, thank you for having me. So I'll be representing Olamide Ejorh, the Executive Director of Lagos Urban Development Initiative. So I'll speak first to what this theme means to me. Then I'll speak about what it means to LUDI, sort of linking why I even joined LUDI in the first place. So just coming from my high school, secondary school, I went to an all-girls school, and in that space, or to be considered an inclusive school, I went to Queen's College, Yaba, Lagos. Within that space, they encouraged a lot of visually impaired girls to, be part of the school. And I was friends with a few of them. But them navigating the school itself, was a bit difficult for them. They had separate classes for them sometimes, but the actual physical space that we were in was not accessible. So they didn't think as far as to that level. Then going outside school, it was obviously much more difficult in a city like Lagos for someone that is visually impaired to navigate a city like Lagos. So most of them would usually be subjected to staying at home, right? When we were during the holidays, then when we were in school, they could move around. So I think that sort of made me a bit angry, right? That the people that you call your friends, you can't really conveniently go out with them, and they can't experience the urban space just like you can. So that sort of led me to an organization like Lagos Urban Development Initiative, which is an NGO that advocates for a livable, sustainable Lagos. majorly. So we're Lagos-based currently, but we can expand when we choose to. But anyway, Lagos advocates for, Ludi advocates for a sustainable and livable Lagos for everyone. So we're not just looking at Lagos for a certain group of people. We're thinking about how Lagos can be livable for everyone from the bottom to the top. So we're thinking in areas like Lagos doesn't really, or the government of Lagos, when they are planning for Lagosians, they usually think from a top-down approach, just like Ms. Street said, but we're thinking from a community level. How can we start to think about the community? How can the community start to be part of the city? Unlike, what we see currently, where they are neglected with the current urban planning and the current design of Lagos. So historically, that has been what we have seen. There's been that top-down approach, but really the real change, or what we feel is the real change, is from the communities. So, and as a response to what we currently have, we see informal, like what Ms. Street said, we see the informal sector, we see the communities coming out to have things like street trading, right, which the government usually frowns upon. But because they are responding to, they're trying to survive, right? Lagos has become that overpopulated city. There's urban sprawl, and a lot of people need to buy things. They need to go out. Transportation system is overjammed, overpacked. The streets are overpacked. People want to easily get stuff on the road or things on the road, and then they're responding to that, and we start to see street trading. So rather than the government trying to change the way people respond to this, how can we start to take their own ideas or take their own responses and build on that, right? So we might not, of course, usually when people start to trade on the streets, it might become a bit messy. But then the point is that they're responding to something. So it's worth taking, it's worth looking into, and then even refining the idea of street trading, but they also respond to what people are responding to. So it's the same way you have when people are walking on the street. There's a particular, sometimes you have a walkway, but then you see a path, on the lawn where people are taking. And universal design, they say this is the path that people would want to take, right? So how then we should be thinking of shifting this walkway to that particular path to accommodate how the response of people, this is the path that they would like to take. So that's the line that Ludi usually takes. We think from when we are designing, when we are thinking about our community project, we like to come from a participatory planning design. So we would not have a project without first consulting or bringing together the community, or even, and then the community has even seen us as some type of safe space, where if they have a problem within their community, they can come to us and we will think about a solution for them together with them. So we have examples like the Oroshoki Allotment Garden in Lagos State here. So the community had the issue of safety. There were a lot of killings, a lot of rape going on under the bridge at that area. And they came to us and we thought of the idea of an allotment garden. And the idea of that was to bring back a dead space to life, or bring a dead space back to life. And thereby just making sure that there's activity going on in that space that would definitely, or has even definitely reduced the crime rates going on in that area. Of course, there is the issue of working with government and all of that, but yeah, but that's the idea, coming from a community perspective and planning together with them, what do they want to see within their community. And just like the general idea of livability globally is, green spaces, low crime, leisure amenities, but also cities like Lagos, the informal cities, community spaces, communities also should have green spaces, should have low crime, should have, leisure amenities, should have public space where they can, come together as a community to relax, but the government, when you're coming from a top-down approach, they don't see that, it's when you start to engage with the community that you hear their needs and you know that these are people too. And, you know, they also need a livable Lagos just like every other person. So.
Thanks for the insights and experience you shared, Miriam. And it's very interesting that what is happening in Lagos, it's not just a Lagos situation. It cuts across many African cities. Just recently here in Accra, the central marketplace, Makola, if you've heard about that. And the place, if you've ever been there before, it is very difficult trying to use those spaces because they are clearly demarcated working spaces or places where the market women are supposed to be. However, these people have gone way beyond the boundaries given them to the extent that you find them right on the road. So if the road is as broad as this, it now becomes very, very narrow. So it increases traffic, the commuting hours and all that. So it's really a bizarre scenario. And I like your point on the fact that these people are responding to something. They didn't just wake up and decided to move their things over there. They are responding to neglect when it comes to development or building or designing people, designing spaces that includes them. So that is why the idea of not just only focus on the top-down approach, but also from the bottom-up approach really matters because these are people who occupy the spaces. So it's only essential for their views or their idea, no matter how we might think is irrelevant, at least they are expressing an idea. So from a policy perspective, usually we should pay attention to the people who we may deem irrelevant or who we may think are not probably significant when it comes to planning, or they are not schooled in architecture or urban design whatsoever. But these people have an idea because they are the ones going to occupy the space. And as the conversation progresses, like I mentioned earlier, if you have any question, you can feel free to raise your hand or you can just drop your question in the message box. We will definitely do well to pick it up. We are trying to make this conversation very valuable at the same time interactive for everyone here to at least share their thoughts or also pick up something from here. So I'll come back to you, Ibrahim. Think with your experiences across multiple African countries and all, how important is it to always consider the community first approach? Because as Miriam mentioned earlier, usually these people are responding to neglect or they are responding to years or decades or even centuries of injustice being meted to them. So how do we build spaces from a bottom-up approach? I don't know if the question is clear.
No, it's certainly very clear.
All right.
Use one scenario. There is a space in Congo, in one of the towns, villages. It's called Lusanga. And Congo has gone through a lot of brutal history, especially during the colonial period under the Belgians and all that. And even back in the 20th century, a lot of the land which was given to Unilever, the farming practices that were done there, because of the monocrop culture farming practices, a lot of the land, topsoil was destroyed. So today, even if you want to plant there, it's very difficult. You have to spend a long time to somehow revive the soil. So for me, those are the kind of projects that I'm interested in. There are a group of artists who live in some of these areas. And what they are doing is that they formed a coalition, like a collective of like different artists coming together. They produce artworks. Sometimes they take even something as simple as chocolates, cocoa, and they make chocolate sculptures from it. And then these sculptures are sold on the international art market. And then the money that they make from it, they use that money in order to be able to buy back some of the land. And then they reforest the land and then they repair the soil and things like that. But they do all of this with the community. And that is very important. Similarly to like some of the other work that I've done in other places, it's always very important to think, because the whole point of art and culture comes back down to the question of justice. Yeah, the reason why we make art is to be able to open up new experiences to the world that we live in. So certainly there isn't any point if you're going to produce something and already the work is somehow contradicting itself because it can only be experienced or only belong to a few group of people. So the collective or the society should always be the starting point of view. And then when you make that the starting point of view, it means that already through the accessibility of it, the question of justice has already been addressed. But of course, sometimes those things can be contrived or can contradict themselves. But I think the main point is for us to constantly re-ask ourselves these questions again and again. But I really think that when anyone is working and starting to think from the community point of view, already it gives a very wide range of possibilities that can happen.
Perfect, perfectly so. Sam, do you have any thoughts on that? The essence of building from the bottom-up approach, where there's the need to consider the people that ordinarily we might think do not matter. Why should we build with them or thinking about them as well?
Yeah, I think when you think about an inclusive city, and that perspective of bringing in people from that bottom-up approach, it's a complete rejection of the initial systems, of the initial colonial planning systems that, prioritize the elite, prioritize specific administrative zones, and exclude the majority of the populations that live in cities. I just think of scholars like Jennifer Robinson, Garth Myers. They've kind of shown that African cities, they've inherited these spatial inequalities, and they remain deeply entrenched in a lot of urban governance that occurs today. And as we kind of reach what I would describe as a more post-colonial era, where there's this rapid urbanization, very, very weak land tenure systems that exist, uncoordinated planning efforts, right? Those things further marginalize public spaces and the people who live in them. And African cities operate within planning systems that are really ill-equipped to manage that informality and really protect a lot of the common spaces that exist and privatize them and exclude the majority of people from them. When I visited Accra last year for the first time, I was shocked to see the lack of, public park spaces. And at first you look at it and you think, oh, this must be some sort of an oversight. Someone just, someone forgot, to think about this. But it's just a reflection of that colonial planning system, right? And the treatment and value of land as only an economic asset and not really a social good. And land that's usually allocated for green spaces often is informally settled. And then it gets commercially redeveloped. And then there's potentially some legal contestation that happens. And I think in my own research work that I've done, inclusive public spaces, that like bottom up approach, it's not necessarily a focus on how can we technically comply. And it's really about embedding those ideas that you mentioned, Ibrahim, of justice, of equity, of lived experience. And just really integrating those pieces into planning and design. And I think there are a lot of contexts within African cities where there are those like third spaces, those park spaces where public life is already happening, right? It's those places like street corners or markets, religious buildings and settings, churchyards. And kind of building from there, starting at those places and working out from there, because these places already exist. People have had to find these spaces and create them themselves. And that idea kind of also aligns with thinking about people as the infrastructure, not necessarily just the park spaces themselves, right? There are social networks that informally have activity and spaces already happening, and they hold cities together, particularly in the African context, where there's that absence of those formal places where people can gather. And so as much as we kind of talk about this idea in the big picture and this big bubble of how things could be, I think the focus now is really using those middle grounds of informal and formal organizations and spaces to think about how do we relationship build, but thinking about equity as less of a box that you're ticking and more of how can we redistribute the space that already exists where there is public life happening and restore power and dignity to people, right? So they feel empowered to say, this is my city, this is my place. And I'm going to advocate in the ways that I can to reclaim that.
Right, right. So thanks so much for that insight. And it was funny when you said it felt as if, I mean, when you were in Accra, that we have forgotten to build parks or public spaces and all that. But if you look critically at it, it is actually a sad happening where every single thing about the city is extremely economic driven. Where if people are not able to draw direct ties between if I do this, what am I going to get in terms of material returns, then it becomes a disincentive for people to move into that venture, which is I think very problematic. And there are, among others, so many structural issues that we have. For instance, the colonial legacies. We can't have this conversation without emphasizing some of these structural issues that we have. So, for instance, in the typical colonial economy back in Ghana, railway lines were developed only in places where they could extract raw materials from. So it wasn't even a means for transport of people just moving from one place to the other. But it was just the idea of extraction, moving resources from point A to point B. And so over time, you find yourself in a structure that when you try to improve transportation among some of these communities which are not originally connected, it becomes a very big challenge because of how we were structured back in the colonial days. And of course, as much as we have tried to move beyond some of these limitations, we always come back to them. And there's a need for a very big push before we are able to reach the levels that we should. Welcome, Olamide. I think Miriam was in for you for a while. Olamide is the founding director of Lagos Urban Development Initiative. And I think we are talking about structural issues that affect us building a livable space. We've already identified a number of things, talking about the colonial legacies, talking about the people being the infrastructure. I don't necessarily just see infrastructure as just materials or just items, but people forming part of it. We've also talked about the fact that we should look at the memories some of these spaces hold. So it's not just about designing a very nice space, but it's also about bringing to the fore the meanings, bringing to the fore the identities and the cultures, which we can have a conversation and also spear our development along. So what are some of the structural issues that you and the team at Ludi, what have you faced? What has been some of your approach around it? Any insights to share?
Sure. And I have
before that, kindly introduce yourself, then we can.
Okay, all right. I mean, I'm just going to say there's so many great questions in the chat as well, and I want to answer some of them. Yeah, my name is Olamide Ejorh. I'm the Executive Director of Lagos Urban Development Initiative. I guess my background is in architecture, but I also do some work in housing rights. And at Ludi, I don't know if we've already been introduced or Miriam introduced Lagos Urban Development Initiative, but we're basically an advocacy organization. We do work around public space design and also transportation, mobility, especially looking at sustainable transportation. So what was the question now?
Yeah, the question was
because they're like, I want to get in there.
I'm basically talking about some of the structural issues you face in Lagos, some of the ways that you have surmounted those issues.
Okay, great. So structural issues, I think a large one for us is really about working with government. So working with communities is also very difficult. It's challenging in its own right, but it's a bit of a softer landing. However, you get to a level where you have worked with certain community groups, you all on board together, you've designed something fantastic. everyone is really ready to take it on and get stuck in, and then you get to the level where you're now approaching like a government official, or you're approaching someone that owns the land, and then the policies and the laws kind of get in the way. And I think that's where we have struggled a lot with. So we've got to a point where we've created all these great communal infrastructure. But then when we want to implement, then we kind of get a bit of a loggerhead. And it's not that we haven't really carried along the government officials throughout the process, but it comes to a point where it's like, okay, this is all really nice. Everyone is bought into it, but can it really be done? And the problem is, I think, that a lot of the power still stays at the top. It doesn't really trickle down. It is not coming. And I think I mentioned, I heard some mention about bottom up approaches and so on. And I think that is the way forward, personally. And from what I can see, it is the only way forward, because we have a limited amount of monetary resources. We have a lot of manpower, and we have a lot of ideas and great knowledge, but we have limited financial resources. And if the power just sits at the top, which means the finances sit at the top, it doesn't get to the bottom. And we can't create kind of local interventions if that continues to happen. So we kind of need to change our thinking a little bit in regards to how we approach urban planning and urban design, and rather than approaching it from a very top-heavy approach, but really from a I don't want to say bottom up, but at a kind of mass approach, if that makes sense. How can we do things en masse rather than do things like, oh, let's build a bridge? Well, is that really the solution to the issues that we're facing? I'm not sure. We're saying we want to get someone from A to B. Most people are walking. So why are we trying to build a bridge? Why are we not building more walking infrastructure? Why are we not building more kind of narrow roads that can take the keke marwas, that's the three-wheelers? Those are the things that people are using. They're cheaper. They're cost-effective. So that's what people are using. Why are we thinking of this kind of grand scale infrastructure? But can I answer one question? Sorry. Which is about refugee camps, because this is what my research is on right now.
Yes,
and so I just thought I wanted to answer it about refugee camps. So what I found out, the question is, are refugee camps part of livable in urban cities? And kind of like, are we thinking about this wrongly? I think this is kind of the approach. And I totally agree. Refugee camps are a humanitarian answer to the issue of migration, or the issue of displacement. And what happens when you create a refugee camp is actually you're not helping anybody. It's a very short-term answer, which, I mean, it works as a short-term answer, but we shouldn't see it as a long-term answer. And we have to change that approach then to starting what is a long-term approach. And so in things that I've been looking at is the fact that refugee camps they get the funding, whereas people are moving, more than 60% of people are moving out of these situations into other cities and then becoming the urban poor in those cities. And all the humanitarian aid is going into the refugee camp and not into these cities. And so this kind of lost group of people who are being displaced are not getting the help that they need. So we really have to rethink this idea of what is a refugee camp and the longevity of it. And then where is the funding for people who are displaced? Where is it going? And is it really helping as a refugee camp? Sorry, yes, that's my thinking on that.
All right. So that was a question from TBN Bahari, who was asking about if refugee camps are part of a livable urban city, or refugee camps inherently are partitioned and absent from urban spaces. So I mean, she was curious to know whether we should continue keeping refugee camps more like outskirts, or we should incorporate them, or we should find a way to involve them in our quest to build accessible cities. I hope that has been answered. But if anyone wants to, I mean, Ibrahim, if you want to share quick thoughts on the question about refugee camps, you can go ahead and do share quick thoughts on that. All right. There is another question in here where Ipia Fosuhine is asking, how do we tap into Africa's informality in planning and building livable cities. She's asking how can we tap into Africa's informality in planning and building livable cities. Ibrahim, if you can attempt that. And for those who can, I mean, just raise their hand and unmute and ask the question directly. That would also be accepted. But of course, if you want to drop it in the message box as well, feel free to do so.
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, yes. So Ikea is asking about how we can tap into Africa's informality in planning and building livable cities.
Oh, well, there is, it's quite interesting. Here on the continent, there are a lot of things that we can do, whereas in Europe and other places, because of bureaucracies and all that, it's almost impossible sometimes to act. Sometimes when there are projects which you have to do in Europe, and you might need to start 3 years in advance, 4 years in advance, because everything is so planned, and they don't leave rooms because no one wants to make a mistake. But the point about the continent is that we still have quite a lot to learn. And we've seen a lot of these mistakes being made. For instance, when you look at Europe, they're constantly talking about the fact that, they have to build spaces that it's accessible to everyone. There are parks and all kinds of other spaces. But sometimes you also go back to these things and you realize that it's not only accessible, it's not accessible to everyone as we think that they are. Like I've been talking a lot about these things, like even with museums, when you go to New York, London, or elsewhere, the major cities around the world, most often the security and then the cleaning staff, they're all minorities. Whereas the majority of the people who are going to the museums, most of them are white middle class people, So sometimes you ask yourself, why is it that we built all these spaces, but yet when you go into, let's say, the museum or the cultural institution, most of the minorities are not in these spaces. But the museum doesn't really think much of it in any way, because they're like, oh yes, the space exists, we built it. If the people are not coming, then it's because they don't have any interest in it. But you can't tell me that like a majority, at least more than 40% of a population in an area certainly do not have the same desires. The reason why maybe we know why that happens is also because of economic policies and so many other things which have also come about as a result of our historical conditions and entanglements. But certainly on the continent, for instance, sometimes there are old buildings here, which maybe we are no longer using a building, like an old factory. And then we think about like, how do we create, let's say a public institution out of it? How do we create it, thinking about the people within those communities in such a way that it can actually serve maybe certain gaps within. Sometimes they just have to be practical or pragmatic decisions. But whereas elsewhere, there's a long list of things. At the end of the day, it will be built all right, but the redistribution or how people are going to use it also becomes another problem. But on the continent, we can learn quite a lot from many things that have happened around the world. And in doing so, because we are rather a community which has always been about working with one another, living with one another. If your grandfather or mother is old, you don't send them to a home, you keep them at home, things like that. But then when it comes to other things like objects, unlike in the Western context, whereas maybe they don't keep their grandparents at home, but when the grandparents leave a document, they keep it for eternity. But we will keep the grandparents at home, but when they leave the document, we destroy it. So the question, of course, it trickles back down again to the relationship that we have, not just to one another, but our relationship to our shared history and our relationships to the current conditions in which we find ourselves, and how simply we just make practical, pragmatic decisions in order to be able to make things happen.
Right. I hope that answers your question. But the idea about keeping our grandparents or great grandparents around, and rather they are okay. Barbara, I see your hand up. I will get you quickly after I make this point. We destroy the objects they leave behind. And I'm actually thinking about my grandparents. Of course, none of them is alive. And, we used to use the currency that in the Ghanaian city before 2007, which we changed into what we currently have. Those coins or even those papers, almost all of them were destroyed. Because we are not even thinking, I'm just talking about what happened in my context, not necessarily. I'm sure people still have those notes around. but those papers or coins as objects hold huge historical value or huge historical essence, which I think if we start looking at object meanings and how they can help us in our development trajectory, I think it's a good point in that. Keeping objects as part of our institutional memory or even our cultural advancement. I think, yeah, Barbara, let me try. Yeah, you can go on and ask your question, Barbara Hammond.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, everyone. I'm an architectural designer here in New York, and I'm Ghanaian by birth, and I've lived in Ghana for some time. And I wanted to comment about the work Ibrahim is doing and the few other professionals that we have here. And I believe Savonnaé did mention green spaces, and I wanted to say that she did say that like in terms of like urban planning, sometimes they're forgotten. And being someone who has been out of school for only 3 years and now practicing, I've just noticed that it's just not a thing that is really thought about in education. And Ibrahim is doing a great job bringing children to these spaces where a building is being constructed right in front of them. All the work is being done right in front of them. In a place like New York, all that is like sort of shielded away from people who are passerbys. So my thing is, those kids at that young age, they're seeing all that work being done in front of them. They're seeing all the skills and everything. But then when you go to college at that point, what does that mean for education? Because especially in Ghana, I don't know how the a college or a university education is sort of like transforming as time goes by, because that could be the biggest issue. We're learning these things, we're seeing all these things at an early age in Ibrahim's situation, which is absolutely great. But what does that mean at a level where you can actually start to contribute to the built environment? And also we have to really be honest with ourselves and our condition in African cities or in Africa overall. We are not like the West. So how do we start to understand who we are and start to take all the informal practices and start to allow that to inform the design that we have? I wrote a thesis on this as well in school, and I noticed that especially for the market women, they have this practice that they have this sort of like traditional sort of informal practice that they like to perform before they start the day, because we have all these customs and all these beliefs. What does that mean for us to really shape our education and our profession as Africans, for that to really shape our cities? That's what it is. That's what's missing. So we have a great panel here, but can anybody speak about how we can let this inform our system moving forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I think you've made very vital points. Talking about one, understanding who we are and building from that context, not necessarily importing ideas or importing solutions, which is very critical. The other point, you also talk about education, where your research and the observation, you think it is something, or it is a failure of our educational system to inculcate at a very younger levels how they can contribute to our lived spaces. So I think these are two profound issues that you've raised, and if anyone can touch on that quickly, Olamide or Ibrahim or Savonnaé, then I see Abraham Safo. I think yes, I would attend to you, but let's share some few thoughts on Barbara's question and even observation.
I
Thanks
nominate.
for your comments. Oh, are we all jumping in?
No, you guys should jump into it.
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, an inclusive African city, it's not a replication of what happens in the global north, right? It cannot be. It's a completely different place, a different context. And I think that's a really important perspective that anyone who's working as an urban planner or in urban advocacy needs to understand. And they also need to understand the context that we exist in terms of power, right? And where that power actually stands and who makes those decisions. As I was kind of chatting in the opening about, it's all good to kind of talk about infrastructure, like hard infrastructure, and how important that is. But I think the advocacy piece, the justice piece, the empowerment piece is really, really central. And Olamide kind of touched on it, right? That bottom-up approach is, I think, the biggest driver of change at this point. A lot of these things that we're talking about are, I think, really wonderful in kind of theory. And of course, some of them are being implemented in practice now. But there needs to be a shift politically, because that's where these big decisions get made, right? That's where you see the values of a country, of a community. And so, again, these institutions that are in the middle of those formal and informal processes have to be very strong and focused in exactly where they stand in shifting that power, and really advocating for that to, I guess, the more formalized pieces of society, because that's essentially where those big drivers of changes in the education system, changes in values, how that shifts. But I'll let my other panelists kind of speak more to that question. Thank you so much.
Right, thanks Al for your inputs. I think Olamide, Ibrahim, then
Sure.
I'll to Safo.
Sure. Yeah. So the question is about, really building capacity, I think, and engaging young designers, urban planners within the educational, or maybe even within formal and non-formal educational system. So yeah, so within Ludi, we actually do this, and it's something that we've been really working towards the past 3 years. We've approached it from a inclusive urban planning or urban design way, where we're trying to, in Nigeria, last year they've been trying to change the urban planning curriculum. And so we've been really trying to advocate and influence what's happening at that level, so that we can engage with young urban planners and designers. And we've also created a module on gendered urban design or urban planning. And we think this is very important. I think the lady that spoke made a very good point in regards to this group of future leaders and future urban planners and people who are going to shape our city, whether it's formal education or not, because we also try to do calls, and we've also done a call recently, or a competition for young children between the ages of 8 and 18 to prefer their ideas for what they want to see their community like. So we're trying to also let them know that they can change their space, even if it's at a small level at this point. Obviously, as they get older, they can broaden that out to policy, to so on, but they can start to change that space. And I think it's very important to encourage young people now, because Africa is young. Like we are a young population. In Nigeria, like 60% of us are under the age, I think, of 18. So, no, under the age of maybe 21. Anyway, very young. So either way, we're still very young. And so we need to encourage, and they need to understand that they have the voice to be able to say they want some change, but they also have to understand what are the tools they can use to change their space, to talk about their space, to understand and to be able to articulate what they want to change or what they don't like. So yeah.
Thank you, Olamide, for sharing that. Democratizing access to urban design, urban planning, education at that level. So yeah, Ibrahim, quick thoughts, then we move to Safi.
Oh, I think a lot has been said on it. So certainly I think there are a lot of people that have questions to ask. So maybe.
Right. So Safo, you can go on and ask your question. If any other person, I think, let me see, I do have questions in the chat box. But yeah, Safo, go ahead. I will address those ones in the chat box. Hello, Ibrahim.
My name is Ibrahim. I'm currently a student in Congo University of Science and Technology.
Could you kindly speak up? I think we are struggling to hear you.
Yeah, so my name is Ibrahim. Is it clear or no? Hello.
Yeah, Abraham.
Yeah. So my name is Ibrahim, and I'm currently a student in the Kwabena University of Science and Technology. I'm a student architect. I'm also focusing my PhD on acculturation within the built environment. I would like to ask, especially my question is directed to Ibrahim Mahama. I'm doing more of the cultural stuff within our built environment, but there's a problem with the reinterpretation of these cultural elements within our modern times. So, what from his experience, what are some of the tricks that we can use to be able to reinterpret these old buildings into modern times, these local materials, to more um, modern times as well? Additionally, I would like to see if they can address the issue of urban planning in our perspective. Our context tends not to fit the modular Western traditional models of planning. So you can see that even in recent days, they are trying to take some people off the street where we have competing demands for maybe the automobile, rickshaws, um, hawking, and issues of pedestrianization. And so how do we balance this within the built environment as professionals? That is my question.
Okay. I hope we got the question.
Yeah, it was a bit faint here and there, but I think I got a gist of it.
Okay.
I think his concern is about like buildings that exist before, like historically and also within the modernist context. Like how do we think about it in relation to like the idea of urbanization and all that? Certainly. That was one of the things I was talking about in the beginning, that we have to take responsibility for some of these spaces. So for instance, if we have an old silo, you know, back in the 60s, even during the colonial period, the British built quite a lot. Like recently, I was learning about some of the buildings that were built by the Germans in like the Volta region and other parts, and like churches and others which have all been abandoned. And then one day you will just wake up and hear that, oh, these buildings have been torn down because someone saw it and thought that it would be a beautiful hotel or whatever. But the question is that if in our own practices, even because sometimes I use even KNUST as an example, the architecture department, whereas I'm always saying that it's very difficult to find like an architect who is training from the university that is interested in, for instance, the revitalization of, let's say, historical architectural forms rather than building new spaces or rather than building like apartmental buildings, condos, and things like that. Because architecture, there's quite a lot that is involved in it. And sometimes architecture is not just about the physicality of the structure, but it's also about how we're able to somehow create conditions that can somehow re-guide the human structure in itself. So certainly when there are buildings, which in my own way, that sometimes I've gone to buy like buildings that were being torn down. Like for instance, when they are building this Marine Drive at in Accra, there are a lot of interesting buildings that are there. Even when they wanted to build a national cathedral, all the colonial buildings that were there, the scholarship secretariat and all that, they destroyed all those buildings. They did not even, as architects who were involved in all that, they did not even take any time to think, how do we work with, let's say, people, creatives even within the city, to find ways in which we can dismantle these buildings and then we can reposition them, even if we don't want them within the same space. Of course, concrete buildings are a lot more difficult, but nonetheless, even that happens. So the question is that even as we as practitioners, is it like when we realize that even these things are going to happen, like the destruction of buildings and all that, how do we save components of these buildings or the buildings themselves? That's why I was talking about the glass factory, like the rubber factory. That like so far there are about 5 Nkrumah factories which have saved, which are bought and saved, like in terms of like the architecture itself and also the materials within them. And then colonial buildings and other modernist, countless number of them. But it's because I think of them purely as archives to begin with, because you imagine that because people have lived in these spaces, there is a part of a memory or the soul of people which is attached to these spaces. And also, just when we think about human nature, we've been very brutal. We've been so destructive. We go into the forest, we cut trees, we produce buildings, timber for buildings and all that. At least the least thing we can do is to show respect at some point when it gets to a point where these buildings are facing total annihilation or things like that. And certainly when we take them and we reconstitute them, then certainly there can be a new perspective to it, because you can reconstitute it in such a way that another generation can be able to see the world through it in a very different way, because it's not so much about the future, but the past also plays a role. Sometimes in order to be able to address the future, you have to be able to go in the past in order to be able to excavate that future, because there are unrealized potentials which have been left in the past. Buildings that were built for something. There were parks that were designed for something. They were never really used that way. And then suddenly they are facing annihilation. So the question is that, how do we go back in time? How do we excavate the promises that are within these spaces, both architecturally within the ecosystem and all that? And how do we present them in such a way that they can only be a gift to another generation?
Something for thoughts. How can we keep the spirit of these spaces as we try to modernize, as we try to build new spaces? Beautifully said. I think from Olamide just put that down. We have Sterling. Sterling has a question. Sterling, kindly go ahead with your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, so it is not more of a question than just lending my voice to the conversation. So circling back to what the question Barbara Hammond asked, I think in a large way, an answer to that would be to find a way to decolonize the minds and the structures and everything that is being done within the continent. Because if you pay close attention, I mean, this has been alluded to by all the speakers. The colonial mindset around land is to use land as a commodity, not land as being related to the human that lives on it. They have more of the top-down approach where they think of experts controlling what is supposed to be done on the land, as not as much as how we Africans think of it as a community-led or participatory planning event. They see infrastructure as dividing us. We see it more as reconnecting and creating a space of justice, peace, love, and harmony. They have used land in more ways to erase indigenous or indigeneity, like the Black presence, indigenous ways of living and doing, while we use it more for celebration and centering our culture. And if you pay close attention, those we have in positions of authority themselves are not decolonized. So it becomes very challenging to ensure that these things trickle down. But then if we could find a way of embedding decolonization of all infrastructures and all sorts of things within our education, within our cultures, I'm sure it would be a good way to start.
Thank you very much, Sterling, on the points you raised. Decolonizing education, decolonizing our mindset is something that I think is definitely a step in the right direction. I think, Barbara, you would want to come back. Before I come back to Barbara, Sharon asked about how can we as citizens engage with policymakers to see the essence of shared public spaces. And in your question, you acknowledge the disparity or the increasing disparity between classes within the spaces that we occupy, rightfully so. So you're asking how can we as citizens engage with policymakers? That's a good one. Saf, would you want to try, or Olamide?
So I mean, I can only maybe speak for the Lagos context because that's where we're working. So I can't speak for another city or another country. But within Lagos, it's actually not hard to engage policymakers. It's not hard. You write a letter, they respond. It's not hard. It's the problem is the implementation of the change, and that's where you have to work hard. So they will listen, and you share your ideas, you share your thoughts. You can even come together as a group. You can go as an individual. They will likely listen to you. Of course, if you have more people, they will listen as well. More, they will engage better. However, when it comes to the change, it's really about advocacy. And here it's about constant engagement. It's not about the conversation you have just once, because you're not just changing one commissioner, one minister, one person's mind. You're trying to change a whole system, and changing a system takes a long time. And so, it's really about constant engagement. It's about constant finding who are the change makers within these systems, who can really kind of take it from A to B, then to the next person who can take it to C. And it's about understanding that system. And that system is quite complex. Someone has mentioned power before. Someone has mentioned, like the political kind of spaces. I mean, it's a very complex space. But you can change policy, which is good. But still, there's something down here. So I can't see my hand. Sorry, you can change policy, but there's still something down here that also needs to change. So your advocacy can't also just be on this level. It also has to be down here. And you also have to understand the needs of what is happening here. And also, those needs are not easily seen. So you may go into a space and people say, oh, actually, what we need is money. Or we had a good presentation this morning. The lady was talking about flooding, farming, and a community in Nigeria. And she was saying, we went in there and all they said was they need money. But actually, what they realized is they need to be able to farm and keep their crops without having damage to the land during when it's when it floods. So it's like, okay, do we create architecture that you can keep their crops safe even when it floods, so that even when it floods, they can still go back and be selling things. There's still something that's in storage. So that's what they did. But I'm just saying that you have to also do a little bit of foundational work to really understand what the issues are and where they are, as well as the advocacy on the top as well. Sorry about my children in the background. It's after school time.
Oh, that's fine. I regards to them. Yeah, Barbara, you'd want to come back here.
Yeah, I was thinking, and I just wanted to ask our panelists if, there's an opportunity for those of us in the profession to engage with our schools across Africa as well, because I think that's one of the ways we can really engage with the young minds, help them think differently about their education, and also how they're addressing design issues in schools. So that is one way. I want to know if that is being done, and how can we people who are here, if they want to put their time to it, how they volunteer their time, because it's very, very important to know to understand how these young minds like myself and those who are coming after me are understanding design, and how that is really impacting their future way of thinking. And about the question about policy making, one issue I have really, really, really been facing as a young designer is, as Black and Brown people, we do not know who our sort of architecture heroes are on an urban scale, like also in art, in art, in architecture, in urban planning. The people who are advocating for us, we don't know who they are, but we know who our white counterparts are. We know who is heading this department. We know who's doing that. How come we are so misinformed and miseducated when it comes to that? We don't know who is really doing research that is actually helping our communities. How can we make that, how can we make that more obvious for the people, or for the generation coming after people on this panel and myself, basically moving forward?
I think
Because
go ahead, sorry.
Oh, sorry, because I didn't learn about Ibrahim Mahama until I was doing my thesis. And that even took me 6 years. And I didn't learn about like Leslie Loco until I was writing my thesis again. So my thing is, how do we do that? How do we start to really demand that we put ourselves in the front, so others can see us and can say, oh, okay, this person is doing this. And I can ask this person this question, and I can see how my research can be guided as a student for me to get the necessary feedback that I need. Thank you.
I think from the the last portion of your question, a lot of it is fatigue, a lot of it is distrust with um, the systems that we have to encounter every day. When you don't see yourself represented, you don't see on a large scale, when you don't see yourself represented, when you're just not really aware of the work that's being done to support your communities. I'm specifically speaking about in the context of the global north right now. It's very easy to kind of shut your mind away from, okay, let's research, let's think about where these heroes exist, right? But I think with talks like this, with panelists who are passionate and who are engaged, this is how we bridge that gap in education, right? We share these conversations happening and we have them often. So it's easy to engage. We can all sit here and be accessible and available to each other for this hour and a half, 2 hours that we have, and continue to share this knowledge moving forward.
Right. I think Olamide, you're saying something.
No, I'm just gonna say I think it's changing. I think there is a lot more awareness and knowledge sharing, and and someone mentioned not to generalize, so I'm not gonna say we as Africans, but I think it's changing. I mean, I definitely hear and see a lot more, but I think with like social media, with media in general, sometimes as you see, you only hear one story. I think Savannah just mentioned, you hear what is the big deal, right? And if everything is being kind of owned by kind of, northern countries, then that's kind of what you hear, right? Those are the examples that you see. I think it's also for us to dig a little bit deeper ourselves, and try our best as uh, as people who are looking for, these examples, and are really trying to understand. I mean, for me, I feel like, sorry, excuse me, just too much. I feel like for us who are able, the knowledge sits, to me anyway, the knowledge sits on the ground, and so it sits with the people. And if you can access the people, then you can gain this knowledge. And unfortunately, we haven't. So I'm also doing this thing I'm also doing work around like academia and journals, and how come like we don't have enough like academic literature that is from, I want to say now, Black voices, not even just African, Black voices. And so it's very hard when you just go into Google and you search, you just find, literature on this topic, but it's all in English. It's all in, you kind of have this blockade. And I think it's also for us to kind of dig a little bit deeper. But I think it is changing, as I mentioned. I think there is a lot more information. People are trying harder to put out information, make sure that they are sharing. It is something that we are not great at. So I must say that, at Ludi, we're not great at doing this. And it's been told to us. So we are trying harder. But yeah, I think it is changing. But I also think we also have to dig a little bit deeper.
Right. We've talking about making some of these people and projects very visible. I think it's at the heart of what we are trying to do as sculpta, where we realize that many people are doing amazing work, especially in the nonprofit space. However, they are only selling pity stories. And it gets to a point where we are tired of seeing these stories. Always a poor child, someone begging and all that. These things may have worked in times past, but we don't think it works anymore. So that is why we try from a brand perspective. How do we, through a strategical approach, make sure that those doing amazing work get seen across multiple touch points, whether it's on social media, whether it is their various communities that they find themselves in. So that at the end of the day, we are able to put into the spotlight people who are doing amazingly well for two major things. One, it inspires other people to do same, because they now become more like the standard, like the people that we would look up to, so that they would inspire our work. And secondly, it also helps them maximize their impact. So I would push Barbara and any other one on the call, kindly follow us We are sharing the link in the message in the chat box. I think there will be more interaction over there. I'll be able to address a number of the interests that are coming in. Yeah, Farida, I think we have you on for a while. Can you go ahead with your question? And we've done over an hour and a half. We would be bringing the conversation to a close sometime pretty soon. A few more questions, then I'll take the last thoughts from our speakers and we can call it a day. So Farida, can you go on?
Hi, everyone. I'm calling from Montreal, Quebec, and also based in New York, New York. I'm coming from three lenses. So I've done academia, I've taught in collaboration with Canadian universities and CanUST, and then also from a nonprofit lens where I've started a Canadian counterpart of Black Architects Interior Designers Association, which was meant for mentorship for youth to enter architecture design. And then in my professional practice, I'm the global director of practice at WXY. It's a firm that focuses on architecture and urban design and planning in New York City. And I run their Canadian operations across Canada. And that being said, I'm mentioning these things because I'm hearing a lot of frustrations in different facets of this and how we operate in North America. And also, I mean, to voice my kind of a little bit of frustration of just finding projects to contribute to in the US. I know in the past, my firm has worked with organizations with Ludi and other things, but just finding the right clients and the right projects. I spent some time in the continent working on some of those projects that have been mentioned on Marine Drive and Trade Fair and Airport Center in Ghana. And I think just finding clients that care about the things that have been brought up as topics on this, because ultimately those are the decision makers. And clients often with the money and the ownership don't care about the things that are being outlined on these calls. And so I guess, how do you tie people like myself that are willing to do work pretty much pro bono for the continent and that are Nigerian of background? I spend a lot of time in West Africa and I care about this because I'm of the diaspora and it's important to me and I'm doing the work. How do I continue to engage, not physically living in Lagos or living in Accra from North America, to offer my insights as a professional? And also, how do we find the right clients or connect them in a way that we're finding things organically and not having to look out, I guess, in ways that are not kind of congruent with just more organic connections? Like, how do we find each other to contribute to one another to build this kind of communities that we want to see, these resilient communities, sustainable communities for the future?
Right. Thanks for the inputs. I think we have Farida, who has shared her background, and also talking about how available she is to work pro bono on such projects related to urban redesign, sustainable development, and all those. What was there an exact question that you asked? I think I missed that. Farida, did you ask an exact question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering from your ends, because you all have the connections and you're seeing these projects come and go, how, like, what's your advice on how to engage from North America, from the diasporic connection? I mean, we've met a lot of the architects. They've come to Canada to speak at different forums, but they're not on the ground as much as they should be, and they don't care about the things outlined here. So I think it's really on us as the people that are living in these communities to connect. And as a professional, I'm outlining that, you know, we're available and we want to hear from you, and also to offer our insights. But really, like, who are the decision makers that you feel that kind of drive these things in your communities, and how can we get in touch with them? And I mean, everything comes down to money. We know this, and funding and government. And so all those things have to work together, money, time, and the effort. So I think just advice in that, so that we're all turning our wheels, because nobody's mentioned this. We've talked a lot about ideas, but really the people that make decisions, how do we get in front of them to make these things a reality?
Right. I think that's a good one. How do we reach the people on the ground, connect them to some of these opportunities? And I think people like Ibrahim and Olamide, who have active presence on the ground, who have projects that you can clearly see what is being done, the impact being made, and even the scalability of what is being done. I think visibility is one important thing in this was, because if we can't see what is being done, then we can't as well also support it. So how do we make sure that we're able to identify some of these projects and also to highlight them, make them known so that we're able to garner the necessary support that's needed. And from our side as Sculpta, that's what I mentioned earlier on, that we are looking at things from the brand perspective first, so that once they are able to put together their identity, once they are able to reach out or be visible in the right spaces, then we can hope that it will attract the necessary people. People like I think Ibrahim and Olamide may attempt, because they have active local presence, they interact with the community leaders and the community people and all that. So, yeah.
I think sometimes, you know, at least from my perspective, and also some of the work, a lot of the work that I've done over the years, I've done most of this work that I've done independently, also knowing that we have to first and foremost acknowledge the conditions in which we inhabit, and also the power of like independence. Of course, that also comes with its own problems, because I don't have enough resources as I think I should have in order to be able to produce. But also the limitation of that resources also gives me the advantage of reflection, because if you start working on something with the community and then you run out of money quickly, and then the project pauses for a couple of months because you're working in order to be able to make money to continue the project, it's also that moment of pause allows you for a moment of reflection. You begin to realize that, oh, the ideas that we were thinking about, or this thing was supposed to become ABC, within this pause, we've realized that no, actually, it might not work in this way. It might, this other direction might rather help it better. So I've realized that even this idea of the limitation of resources is quite important. Most often with these big architects and projects that happen, you have money to produce something from A to B, you start, and then there is no looking back. You're doing it all the way till you finish. So there is barely any time to pause at some point and realize that, why are we really building this? Is this thing going to work the same way we thought about it? But then you always realize that even when buildings are being made and then a crisis situation comes and the buildings are not being completed, and later on we have to revisit them, they become even far more interesting, because now we've had time to live with them. We've seen all the gaps and all the potentials that could also come out from it, and then we're able to make new choices from it. But certainly I think that there are, of course, a lot of different practitioners on the continent locally who are doing things. I don't believe in actually having money in order to be able to do things. I think first and foremost, it's about the integrity of people and why they are doing what they are doing, and what that thing actually means to the future of the continent in terms of how it allows us to be able to think differently. It's an ideological problem that we're dealing with most of the time. And I think Nkrumah already was very much aware of this back in the 50s, when he was advocating for this kind of strong Pan-Africanist connection, and then hoping for United Africa and all that, because ideologically, if we're able to like rethink about our relationships to how we build, how we, the systems around it, certainly it will really change the continent and the world that we find ourselves in.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, for that insight. Like I mentioned, the conversation wouldn't end here. I mean, we are, of course, the webinar would end, but we'll definitely go ahead with the conversation on social media. If there are any exciting collaborations or partnerships that will need to be facilitated as part of our attempts to be on the ground or support community development, we are definitely up for that. So you can reach us on our social media channels as we are dropping them in the chat box. So we would definitely want to move beyond just a conversation here to actual impact on the ground. If there are no other questions, I think I'll just take final rounds from the speakers. I mean, where do we go from here? I think we've discussed much about the ideas, we've talked about the problems and all, but where do we go from here, and how this conversation comes all together? Yes, any last?
From Aisha Diallo, who was asking about the relationship between the urban and the rural. We haven't looked at that. And it's quite a very important one. You know, there is I named Red Clay because I was very much inspired by this album by Yusuf Indo. It's called Red Clay. It's called Joko, From Village to Town. And the idea that the rural context can somehow inspire the way the urban, the formation of the urban or the thinking of the urban. In the early 60s, there was a commemoration in what's the name? In Legon, and then Nkrumah went, and then he said that it is time, I think, for the gown to go to town. The idea that through our formal education, we should go back into the market spaces in order to be able to like somehow exercise a new sense of intellectual work. Of course, already when we were in school, a lot of our professors like caricature and many others were really ensuring that and encouraging students to go to town, go to the market space to learn from how the market women are arranging things in the market. Of course, when you go to the market and you see how like the market women have arranged their things, how you walk in between, like you go from a tomato seller to an onion seller to others, there's quite a lot to learn from it, aside even the way they display their products and all that. But certainly, even like whilst we're here in Tamale, for instance, I remember when I started buying land for building Red Clay, when I bought land which was demarcated for building like homes, I also bought land that was made for building a school. I bought land that was demarcated for building, let's say, a share plantation, land for building, let's say, a factory. But the point is that as an artist, as one of our colleagues mentioned, it's not about thinking about land as a commodity. It's thinking about land as a gift. Like any other thing, when you're born into this world, you don't come with a piece of land. You just come with your bare body. So again, our relationship to that land, what is the use of land to us? So for instance, the idea of reforesting area. So for instance, if you buy land and you're like artistically, and then for instance, you're an artist and that land is demarcated for, let's say, a share plantation, do you go ahead and cut the trees on it and build, let's say, a hotel or whatever? Or you actually reinforce the idea of a share plantation or rejuvenate the land and think about that in relation to how that can recontextualize what it means for us to be able to, let's say, build livable spaces within the idea of a share plantation or something like that, or far beyond that, just the idea of us living within it, but idea of that as an element within itself. Or if you buy a land that is demarcated for a school, how do we work with the community in order to be able to build a school within that space that allows for us to think differently about education? Also, I'm answering Isa's question and also just my final take at the same time. So it's just that thing of us as practitioners. I think one of the things that we have to leave ourselves with from here is that responsibility for us to realize that we equally are part of the system. We're equally part of the problems and everything that is around us. If we want to see change in the world, then within our own practices, we have to learn to exercise a lot more responsibility and also realize that the reason why the world that we live in is sorry to say, as fucked up as it is because we are clearly living within ideological divides and all that. And you can see that in some of the big economies like in America and many other places, in some of these ideological divides. But in Africa, sometimes we really don't think that even these things exist, but it does really exist and it does matter. The decision of making a choice of building one thing over the other will go a long way to determine whether we can have a certain structural or fundamental change or not. So whichever be the case, I think that we should always remind ourselves that we can be the tool for repair within the communities that we find ourselves.
Certainly would remind ourselves of that. Thank you very much, Ibrahim, your thoughts, closing remarks. Sal, Olamide, and then we can bring the conversation to an end now.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been very interesting to hear the insights of the rest of the panel and those who have joined. And I want to echo the words that Ibrahim said, that we need to think of our roles as planners, architects, in whatever context we work in, as less just practitioners, but also advocates, and centering our practices around equity and justice. Those are, I feel, some of the most important pieces of our work. And I think the reality is that we have to recognize that there are persons who hold power, and there are voices that are missing from the way that cities are planned
I think she dropped off, unfortunately. Hopefully she reconnects. Olamide, would you want to take your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've said a lot, and it's really great conversation. I think it's really great that we're having this conversation in the first place. And I think someone mentioned around, I think it's also for us to create more platforms where we can share knowledge and where we can gain kind of understanding, have more conversations around this topic. But also then how do we shift that from just a discussion to something that is happening on the ground? And I guess my last thing, I think, as was just being said around kind of really changing the thinking to think about urban design, urban planning as something that is just and locally attuned. And I think, and it's not just for us in this room to think this way, but we have to kind of broaden this thinking wider.
Thank you very much, Olamide, and amazing work you are doing with your team. It's been a good conversation, and clearly we could have gone on and on and on, because the idea of designing spaces that present opportunity to all of us is very extensive, and we can talk about it from different perspectives. But like I said, we are trying as much as possible to move beyond the conversation, and very soon we'll be sharing the exciting work we are doing with Ludi. Yes, I know you're excited about that, Olamide, but yeah, we would make it public, and hopefully we are able to connect the dots. One of the things that we are doing here is to also make sure that we don't build in silos, because what Ibrahim is doing can easily be replicated, let's say, in another part of the continent, or the idea of transfer of knowledge is very essential. So you're trying to keep that communal spirit, you're trying to keep that sense of community. I mean, it's become a very popular buzzword and all that. We are trying to live it as it is, so that we are able to connect the various pieces that we are building. And collectively, we are able to build something that is bigger and also would inspire the generations behind us as well. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for sharing your insights. And we will definitely keep this going. Let's all do have a nice day, and hopefully we'll talk sooner than later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.